I was not aware at first of the many discussions which had gone on about that window. It was almost opposite one of the windows of the large, old-fashioned drawing-room of the house in which I spent that summer, which was of so much importance in my life. Our house and the library were on opposite sides of the broad High Street of St. Rule's, which is a fine street, wide and ample, and very quiet, as strangers think who come from noisier places. But in a summer evening there is much coming and going, and the stillness is full of sound, the sound of footsteps and pleasant voices, softened by the summer air. There are even exceptional moments when it is noisy, the time of the fair, and on Saturday night sometimes, and when there are excursion trains. Then even the softest sunny air of the evening will not smooth the harsh tones and the stumbling steps, but at these unlovely moments we shut the windows, and even I, who am so fond of that deep recess where I can take refuge from all that is going on inside, and make myself a spectator of all the varied story out of doors, withdraw from my watchtower. To tell the truth, there never was very much going on inside. The house belonged to my aunt, to whom, she says, thank God, nothing ever happens. I believe that many things have happened to her in her time, but that was all over at the period of which I am speaking, and she was old and very quiet. Her life went on in a routine never broken. She got up at the same hour every day, and did the same things in the same rotation, day by day the same. She said that this was the greatest support in the world, and that routine is a kind of salvation. It may be so, but it is a very dull salvation, and I used to feel that I would rather have incident, whatever kind of incident it might be. But then at that time I was not old, which makes all the difference. At the time of which I speak, the deep recess of the drawing-room window was a great comfort to me. Though she was an old lady, perhaps because she was so old, she was very tolerant, and had a kind of feeling for me. She never said a word, but often gave me a smile when she saw how I had built myself up with my books and my basket of work. I did very little work, I fear, now and then a few stitches when the spirit moved me, or when I had got well afloat in a dream, and was more tempted to follow it out than to read my book, as sometimes happened. At other times, and if the book were interesting, I used to get through volume after volume sitting there, paying no attention to anybody. And yet I did pay a kind of attention. Aunt Mary's old ladies came in to call, and I heard them talk, though I very seldom listened. But for all that, if they had anything to say that was interesting, it is curious how I found it in my mind afterwards, as if the air had blown it to me. They came and went, and I had the sensation of their old bonnets gliding out and in, and their dresses rustling, and now and then had to jump up and shake hands with someone who knew me, and asked after my papa and mamma. Then Aunt Mary would give me a little smile again, and I slipped back to my window. She never seemed to mind. My mother would not have let me do it, I know. She would have remembered dozens of things there were to do. She would have sent me upstairs to fetch something which I was quite sure she did not want, or downstairs to carry some quite unnecessary message to the housemaid. She liked to keep me running about. Perhaps that was one reason why I was so fond of Aunt Mary's drawing-room, and the deep recess of the window, and the curtain that fell half over it, and the broad window-seat, where one could collect so many things without being found fault with for untidiness. Whenever we had anything the matter with us in these days, we were sent to St. Rule's to get up our strength, and this was my case at the time of which I am going to speak. Everybody had said, since ever I learned to speak, that I was fantastic and fanciful and dreamy, and all the other words with which a girl who may happen to like poetry and to be fond of thinking is so often made uncomfortable. People don't know what they mean when they say fantastic. It sounds like Madge Wildfire or something of that sort. My mother thought I should always be busy to keep nonsense out of my head. But really I was not at all fond of nonsense. I was rather serious than otherwise. I would have been no trouble to anybody if I had been left to myself. It was only that I had a sort of second sight, and was conscious of things to which I paid no attention. Even when reading the most interesting book, the things that were being talked about blew into me, and I heard what the people were saying in the streets as they passed under the window. Aunt Mary always said I could do 2 or indeed 3 things at once, both read and listen and see. I am sure that I did not listen much, and seldom looked out of set purpose, as some people do who notice what bonnets the ladies in the street have on, but I did hear what I couldn't help hearing, even when I was reading my book, and I did see all sorts of things, though often for a whole half-hour I might never lift my eyes. This does not explain what I said at the beginning, that there were many discussions about that window. It was, and still is, the last window in the row of the college library, which is opposite my aunt's house in the High Street. Yet it is not exactly opposite, but a little to the west, so that I could see it best from the left side of my recess. I took it for granted that it was a window like any other till I first heard the talk about it which was going on in the drawing-room. "Have you never made up your mind, Mrs. Balcarres," said old Mr. Pitt-Milley, "whether that window opposite is a window or no?" He said Mistress Balcarres, and he was always called Mr. Pitt-Milley, Morton, which was the name of his place. "I am never sure of it, to tell the truth," said Aunt Mary, "all these years." "Bless me," said one of the old ladies, "and what window may that be?" Mr. Pitt-Milley had a way of laughing as he spoke, which did not please me, but it was true that he was not perhaps desirous of pleasing me. He said, "Oh, just the window opposite," with his laugh running through his words. "Our friend can never make up her mind about it, though she has been living opposite it since." "You need never mind the date," said another. "The library window! Dear me, what should it be but a window? Up at that height, it could not be a door." "The question is," said my aunt, "if it is a real window with glass on it, or if it is merely painted up, or if it once was a window and has been built up. And the oftener people look at it, the less they are able to say." "Let me see this window," said old Lady Conby, who was very active and strong-minded, and then they all came crowding upon me, 3 or 4 old ladies, very eager, and Mr. Pitt-Milley's white hair appearing over their heads, and my aunt sitting quiet and smiling behind. "I mind the window very well," said Lady Conby. "Ay, and so do more than me, but in its present appearance it is just like any other window, but it has not been cleaned, I should say, in the memory of man." "I see what you mean," said one of the others. "It is just a very dead thing without any reflection in it, but I've seen as bad before." "Ay, it's dead enough," said another, "but that's no rule, for these hizzies of women servants in this ill age." "Nay, the women are well enough," said the softest voice of all, which was Aunt Mary's. "I will never let them risk their lives cleaning the outside of mine, and there are no women servants in the old library. There is maybe something more in it than that." They were all pressing into my recess, pressing upon me, a row of old faces peering into something they could not understand. I had a sense in my mind how curious it was, the wall of old ladies in their old satin gowns all glazed with age, Lady Conby with her lace about her head. Nobody was looking at me or thinking of me, but I felt unconsciously the contrast of my youngness to their oldness, and stared at them as they stared over my head at the library window. I had given it no attention up to this time. I was more taken up with the old ladies than with the thing they were looking at. "The framework is all right at least. I can see that. And painted black. And the panes are painted black too. It's no window, Miss Balcarres. It has been filled in the days of the window duties. You will mind, Lady Carnby." "Mind?" said that oldest lady. "I mind when your mother was married, Jeanie, and that's neither the day nor yesterday. But as for the window, it's just a delusion, and that is my opinion of the matter if you ask me." "There's a great want of light in that muckle room at the college," said another. "If it was a window, the library would have more light." "One thing is clear," said one of the younger ones. "It cannot be a window to see through. It may be filled in, or it may be built up, but it is not a window to give light." "And who ever heard of a window that was not to see through?" Lady Carnby said. I was fascinated by the look on her face, which was a curious, scornful look, as of one who knew more than she chose to say. And then my wandering fancy was caught by her hand as she held it up, throwing back the lace that was drooped over it. Lady Carnby's lace was the chief thing about her. Heavy black Spanish lace with large flowers. Everything she wore was trimmed with it. A large veil of it hung over her old bonnet. But her hand coming out of this heavy lace was a curious thing to see. She had very long fingers, very taper, which had been much admired in her youth, and her hand was very white, or rather more than white, pale, bleached and bloodless, with large blue veins standing up upon the back, and she wore some very fine rings, among others a big diamond in an ugly old claw setting. They were too big for her, and were wound round and round with yellow silk to make them keep on. And this little cushion of silk, turned brown with long wearing, had twisted round so that it was more conspicuous than the jewels, while the big diamond blazed underneath in the hollow of her hand, like some dangerous thing hiding and sending out darts of light. The hand, which seemed to come almost to a point with this strange ornament underneath, clutched at my half-terrified imagination. It too seemed to mean far more than was said. I felt as if it might clutch me with sharp claws, and the lurking, dazzling creature bite, with a sting that would go to the heart. Presently, however, the circle of the old faces broke up, and the old ladies returned to their seats, and Mr. Pitt-Milley, small but very erect, stood up in the midst of them, talking with mild authority like a little oracle among the ladies. Only Lady Carnby always contradicted the neat, little old gentleman. She gesticulated when she talked, like a Frenchwoman, and darted forth that hand of hers with the lace hanging over it, so that I always caught a glimpse of the lurking diamond. I thought she looked like a witch among the comfortable little group which gave such attention to everything Mr. Pitt-Milley said. "For my part, it is my opinion there is no window there at all," he said. "It is very like the thing that is called in scientific language an optical illusion. It arises generally, if I may use such a word in the presence of ladies, from a liver that is not just in the perfect order and balance that organ demands. And then you will see things. A blue dog, I remember, was the thing in one case, and in another—" "The man has gained gait," said Lady Carnby. "I mind the windows in the old library as long as I mind anything. Is the library itself an optical illusion too?" "No, no, and no, no," said the old ladies. "A blue dog would be a strange vagary, but the library we have all kent from our youth," said one. "And I mind when the assemblies were held there once a year, when the town hall was building," another said. "It is just a great divert to me," said Aunt Mary. But what was strange was that she paused there and said in a low tone, now, and then went on again. For whoever comes to my house, there are discussions about that window. I have never just made up my mind about it myself. Sometimes I think it's a case of these wicked window duties, as you said, Miss Jeanie, when half the windows in our houses were blocked up to save the tax. And then I think it may be due to that blank kind of building like the great new buildings on the earthen mound in Edinburgh, where the windows are just ornaments. And then, whiles, I am sure I can see the glass shining when the sun catches it in the afternoon. You could so easily satisfy yourself, Mrs. Balcarres, if you were to— Give a laddie a penny to cast a stone and see what happens, said Lady Carnby. But I am not sure that I have any desire to satisfy myself, Aunt Mary said. And then there was a stir in the room, and I had to come out from my recess and open the door for the old ladies, and see them downstairs, as they all went away, following one another. Mr. Pitt-Milley gave his arm to Lady Carnby, though she was always contradicting him, and so the tea-party dispersed. Aunt Mary came to the head of the stairs with her guests in an old-fashioned gracious way, while I went down with them to see that the maid was ready at the door. When I came back, Aunt Mary was still standing in the recess looking out. Returning to my seat, she said, with a kind of wistful look, "Well, honey, and what is your opinion?" "I have no opinion. I was reading my book at the time," I said. "And so you were, honey, and no very civil. But all the same I ken well you heard every word we said." It was a night in June. Dinner was long over, and had it been winter the maids would have been shutting up the house, and my Aunt Mary preparing to go upstairs to her room. But it was still clear daylight, that daylight out of which the sun has been long gone, and which has no longer any rose reflections, but all has sunk into a pearly neutral tint, a light which is daylight, yet is not day. We had taken a turn in the garden after dinner, and now we had returned to what we called our usual occupations. My aunt was reading. The English post had come in, and she had got her Times, which was her great diversion. The Scotsman was her morning reading, but she liked her Times at night. As for me, I too was at my usual occupation, which at that time was doing nothing. I had a book as usual, and was absorbed in it, but I was conscious of all that was going on all the same. The people strolled along the broad pavement, making remarks as they passed under the open window which came up into my story or my dream, and sometimes made me laugh. The tone and the faint sing-song, or rather chant of the accent, which was a wee fifish, was novel to me, and associated with holiday, and pleasant, and sometimes they said to each other something that was amusing, and often something that suggested a whole story, but presently they began to drop off. The footsteps slackened, the voices died away. It was getting late, though the clear soft daylight went on and on, all through the lingering evening, which seemed to consist of interminable hours, long, but not weary, drawn out as if the spell of the light and the outdoor life might never end. I had now and then, quite unawares, cast a glance at the mysterious window which my aunt and her friends had discussed. As I felt, though I dared not say it even to myself, rather foolishly. It caught my eye without any intention on my part, as I paused, as it were, to take breath, in the flowing and current of undistinguishable thoughts and things from without and within, which carried me along. First it occurred to me, with a little sensation of discovery, how absurd to say it was not a window, a living window, one to see through. Why, then, had they never seen it, these old folk? I saw as I looked up suddenly the faint greyness as of a visible space within, a room behind, certainly, dim, as it was natural a room should be on the other side of the street, quite indefinite, yet so clear that if someone were to come to the window there would be nothing surprising in it. For certainly there was a feeling of space behind the panes which these old half-blind ladies had disputed about, whether they were glass or only fictitious panes marked on the wall. How silly, when eyes that could see could make it out in a minute. It was only a greyness at present, but it was unmistakable, a space that went back into gloom, as every room does when you look into it across a street. There were no curtains to show whether it was inhabited or not, but a room, as distinctly as ever room was. I was pleased with myself, but said nothing, while Aunt Mary rustled her paper, waiting for a favourable moment to announce a discovery which settled her problem at once. Then I was carried away upon the stream again, and forgot the window, till somebody threw unawares a word from the outer world. "I'm going home. It'll soon be dark." Dark? What was the fool thinking of? It never would be dark if one waited out, wandering in the soft air for hours longer. And then my eyes, acquiring easily that new habit, looked across the way again. Ah, now, nobody indeed had come to the window, and no light had been lighted, seeing it was still beautiful to read by, a still, clear, colourless light. But the room inside had certainly widened. I could see the grey space and air a little deeper, and a sort of vision, very dim, of a wall and something against it, something dark, with the blackness that a solid article, however indistinctly seen, takes in the lighter darkness that is only space, a large, black, dark thing coming out into the grey. I looked more intently and made sure it was a piece of furniture, either a writing table or perhaps a large bookcase. No doubt it must be the last, since this was part of the old library. I never visited the old college library, but I had seen such places before, and I could well imagine it to myself. How curious that for all the time these old people had looked at it, they had never seen this before. It was more silent now, and my eyes, I suppose, had grown dim with gazing, doing my best to make it out, when suddenly Aunt Mary said, "Will you ring the bell, my dear? I must have my lamp." "Your lamp?" I cried, "when it is still daylight?" But then I gave another look at my window and perceived with a start that the light had indeed changed, for now I saw nothing. "Your lamp," I cried, "when it is still daylight?" But then I gave another look at my window and perceived with a start that the light had indeed changed, for now I saw nothing. It was still light, but there was so much change in the light that my room with the grey space and the large shadowy bookcase had gone out, and I saw them no more. For even a Scotch night in June, though it looks as if it would never end, does darken at the last. I had almost cried out, but checked myself and rang the bell for Aunt Mary, and made up my mind that I would say nothing till next morning, when to be sure naturally it would be more clear. Next morning I rather think I forgot all about it, or was busy, or was more idle than usual. The two things meant nearly the same. At all events I thought no more of the window, though I still sat in my own, opposite it, but occupied with some other fancy. Aunt Mary's visitors came as usual in the afternoon, but their talk was of other things, and for a day or two nothing at all happened, to bring back my thoughts into this channel. It might be nearly a week before the subject came back, and once more it was old Lady Carnby who set me thinking. Not that she said anything upon that particular theme, but she was the last of my aunt's afternoon guests to go away, and when she rose to leave she threw up her hands, with those lively gesticulations which so many old Scotch ladies have. "My faith," said she, "there's that bairn still like a dream. Is the creature bewitched, Mary Belcares? And is she bound to sit there by night and by day for the rest of her days? You should mind that there's things about,
uncanny for women of our blood."
I was too much startled at first to recognize that it was of me she was speaking. She was like a figure in a picture, with her pale face the colour of ashes, and the big pattern of the Spanish lace hanging half over it, and her hand held up, with the big diamond blazing at me from the inside of her uplifted palm. It was held up in surprise, but it looked as if it were raised in malediction, and the diamond threw out darts of light and glared and twinkled at me. If it had been in its right place it would not have mattered, but there, in the open of the hand, I started up, half in terror, half in life, and then the old lady laughed and her hand dropped.
"I've wakened you to life and broke the spell," she said, nodding her old head at me, while the large black silk flowers of the lace waved and threatened. And she took my arm to go downstairs, laughing and bidding me to be steady and no tremble and shake like a broken reed. "You should be as steady as a rock at your age. I was like a young tree," she said, leaning so heavily that my willowy girlish frame quivered. "I was a support to virtue, like Pamela in my time."
"Aunt Mary, Lady Conby is a witch," I cried when I came back. "Is that what you think, honey? Well, maybe she once was," said Aunt Mary, whom nothing surprised. And it was that night once more after dinner and after the post came in, and the Times, that I suddenly saw the library window again. I had seen it every day and noticed nothing, but tonight, still in a little tumult of mind over Lady Conby and her wicked diamond which wished me harm, and her lace which waved threats and warnings at me, I looked across the street, and there I saw quite plainly a room opposite, far more clear than before. I saw dimly that it must be a large room, and that the big piece of furniture against the wall was a writing desk. That, in a moment, when first my eyes rested upon it, was quite clear. A large, old-fashioned escritoire standing out into the room, and I knew by the shape of it that it had a great many pigeonholes and little drawers in the back, and a large table for writing. There was one just like it in my father's library at home. It was such a surprise to see it all so clearly that I closed my eyes, for the moment almost giddy, wondering how Papa's desk could have come here. And then when I reminded myself that this was nonsense, and that there were many such writing tables besides Papa's, and looked again, lo, it had all become quite vague and indistinct as it was at first, and I saw nothing but the blank window, of which the old ladies could never be certain whether it was filled up to avoid the window tax, or whether it had ever been a window at all. This occupied my mind very much, and yet I did not say anything to Aunt Mary. For one thing, I rarely saw anything at all in the early part of the day, but then that is natural. You can never see into a place from outside, whether it is an empty room or a looking-glass or people's eyes or anything else that is mysterious, in the day. It has, I suppose, something to do with the light, but in the evening in June in Scotland, then is the time to see. For it is daylight, yet it is not day, and there is a quality in it which I cannot describe. It is so clear, as if every object was a reflection of itself. I used to see more and more of the room as the days went on. The large escritoire stood out more and more into the space, with sometimes white glimmering things which looked like papers lying on it. And once or twice I was sure I saw a big pile of books on the floor close to the writing table, as if they had gilding upon them in broken specks, like old books. It was always about the time when the lads in the street began to call to each other that they were going home, and sometimes a shriller voice would come from one of the doors, bidding somebody to cry upon the laddies to come back to their suppers. That was always the time I saw best, though it seemed close upon the moment when the veil seemed to fall, and the clear radiance became less living, and all the sounds died out of the street, and Aunt Mary said in her soft voice, "Honey, will you ring for the lamp?
She said honey, as people say darling, and I think it is a prettier word. Then finally, while I sat one evening with my book in my hand, looking straight across the street, not distracted by anything, I saw a little movement within. It was not anyone visible, but everybody must know what it is to see the stir in the air, the little disturbance. You cannot tell what it is, but that it indicates someone there, even though you can see no one. Perhaps it is a shadow making just one flicker in the still place. You may look at an empty room and the furniture in it for hours, and then suddenly there will be the flicker, and you know that something has come into it. It might only be a dog or a cat. It might be, if that were possible, a bird flying across. But it is someone, something living which is so different, so completely different in a moment from the things that are not living. It seemed to strike right through me, and I gave a little cry. Then Aunt Mary stirred a little and put down the huge newspaper that almost covered her from sight, and said, "What is it, honey?" I cried, "Nothing," with a little gasp, quickly, for I did not want to be disturbed just at this moment when somebody was coming. But I suppose she was not satisfied, for she got up and stood behind to see what it was, putting her hand on my shoulder. It was the softest touch in the world, but I could have flung it off angrily. For that moment everything was still again, and the place grew grey, and I saw no more. "Nothing," I repeated, but I was so vexed I could have cried. "I told you it was nothing, Aunt Mary. Don't you believe me that you came to look and spoil it all?" I did not mean, of course, to say these last words. They were forced out of me. I was so much annoyed to see it all melt away like a dream. For it was no dream, but as real as myself, or anything I ever saw. She gave my shoulder a little pat with her hand. "Honey," she said, "were you looking at something? Is it what?" I wanted to say, shaking off her hand, but something in me stopped me, for I said nothing at all, and she went quietly back to her place. I suppose she must have rung the bell herself, for immediately I felt the soft flood of the light behind me, and the evening outside dimmed down as it did every night, and I saw nothing more. It was next day, I think on the afternoon, that I spoke. It was brought on by something she said about her fine work. "I get a mist before my eyes," she said. "You will have to learn my old lace stitches, honey, for I soon will not see to draw the threads." "Oh, I hope you will keep your sight," I cried without thinking what I was saying. I was then young and very matter-of-fact. I had not found out that one may mean something, yet not half or 100th part of what one seems to mean, and even then probably hoping to be contradicted if it is anyhow against oneself. "My sight?" she said, looking up at me with a look that was almost angry. "There is no question of losing my sight. On the contrary, my eyes are very strong. I may not see to draw fine threads, but I see at a distance as well as ever I did, as well as you do." "I did not mean any harm, Aunt Mary," I said. "I thought you said. But how can your sight be as good as ever when you are in doubt about that window? I can see into the room as clear as—" My voice wavered, for I had just looked up and across the street, and I could have sworn that there was no window at all, but only a false image of one painted on the wall. "Ah," she said, with a little tone of keenness and of surprise, and she half rose up, throwing down her work hastily, as if she meant to come to me. Then, perhaps seeing the bewildered look on my face, she paused and hesitated. "Ay, honey," she said. "Have you got so far, Ben, as that?" What did she mean? Of course I knew all the old Scotch phrases as well as I knew myself, but it is a comfort to take refuge in a little ignorance.
and I know I pretended not to understand whenever I was put out. "I don't know what you mean by far ben," I cried out, very impatient. I don't know what might have followed, but someone just then came to call, and she could only give me a look before she went forward, putting out her hand to her visitor. It was a very soft look, but anxious, and as if she did not know what to do. And she shook her head a very little, and I thought, though there was a smile on her face, there was something wet about her eyes. I retired into my recess, and nothing more was said. But it was very tantalizing that it should fluctuate so, for sometimes I saw that room quite plain and clear, quite as clear as I could see Papa's library, for example, when I shut my eyes. I compared it naturally to my father's study, because of the shape of the writing table, which, as I tell you, was the same as his. At times I saw the papers on the table quite plain, just as I had seen his papers many a day, and the little pile of books on the floor at the foot, not ranged regularly in order, but put down one above the other, with all of their angles going different ways, and a speck of the old gilding shining here and there. And then again at other times I saw nothing, absolutely nothing, and was no better than the old ladies who had peered over my head, drawing their eyelids together, and arguing that the window had been shut up because of the old long-abolished window tax, or else that it had never been a window at all. It annoyed me very much at those dull moments to feel that I too puckered up my eyelids and saw no better than they. Aunt Mary's old ladies came and went day after day while June went on. I was to go back in July, and I felt that I should be very unwilling indeed to leave until I had quite cleared up, as I was indeed in the way of doing, the mystery of that window which changed so strangely and appeared quite a different thing, not only to different people, but to the same eyes at different times. Of course, I said to myself, it must simply be an effect of the light. And yet I did not quite like that explanation either, but would have been better pleased to make out to myself that it was some superiority in me which made it so clear to me, if it were only the great superiority of young eyes over old. Though that was not quite enough to satisfy me, seeing it was a superiority which I shared with every little lass and lad in the street. I rather wanted, I believe, to think that there was some particular insight in me which gave clearness to my sight, which was a most impertinent assumption, but really did not mean half the harm it seems to mean when it is put down here in black and white. I had several times again, however, seen the room quite plain, and made out that it was a large room, with a great picture in a dim gilded frame hanging on the farther wall, and many other pieces of solid furniture making a blackness here and there, besides the great escritoire against the wall, which had evidently been placed near the window for the sake of the light. One thing became visible to me after another, till I almost thought I should end by being able to read the old lettering on one of the big volumes which projected from the others and caught the light. But this was all preliminary to the great event which happened about Midsummer Day, the day of St. John, which was once so much thought of as a festival, but now means nothing at all in Scotland any more than any other of the saints' days, which I shall always think a great pity and loss to Scotland, whatever Aunt Mary may say. It was about midsummer, I cannot say exactly to a day when, but near that time when the great event happened. I had grown very well acquainted by this time with the large dim room. Not only the escritoire, which was very plain to me now, with the papers upon it and the books at its foot, but the great picture that hung against the farther wall, and various other shadowy pieces of furniture, especially a chair which one evening I saw had been moved into the space before the escritoire, a little change which made my heart beat, for it spoke so distinctly of someone who must have been there. the someone who had already made me start 2 or 3 times before, by some vague shadow of him, or thrill of him which made a sort of movement in the silent space. A movement which made me sure that next minute I must see something, or hear something which would explain the whole, if it were not that something always happened outside to stop it at the very moment of its accomplishment. I had no warning this time of movement or shadow. I had been looking into the room very attentively a little while before, and had made out everything almost clearer than ever, and then had bent my attention again on my book, and read a chapter or two at a most exciting period of the story, and consequently had quite left St. Rule's, and the High Street, and the college library, and was really in a South American forest, almost throttled by the flowery creepers, and treading softly, lest I should put my foot on a scorpion or a dangerous snake. At this moment, something suddenly calling my attention to the outside, I looked across, and then, with a start, sprang up, for I could not contain myself. I don't know what I said, but enough to startle the people in the room, one of whom was old Mr. Pitt-Milley. They all looked round upon me to ask what was the matter, and when I gave my usual answer of "Nothing," sitting down again shamefaced but very much excited, Mr. Pitt-Milley got up and came forward and looked out, apparently to see what was the cause. He saw nothing, for he went back again, and I could hear him telling Aunt Mary not to be alarmed, for Missy had fallen into a doze with the heat, and had startled herself waking up, at which they all laughed. Another time I could have killed him for his impertinence, but my mind was too much taken up now to pay attention. My head was throbbing, and my heart beating. I was in such high excitement, however, that to restrain myself completely, to be perfectly silent, was more easy to me then than at any other time of my life. I waited until the old gentleman had taken his seat again, and then I looked back. Yes, there he was. I had not been deceived. I knew then, when I looked across, that this was what I had been looking for all the time, that I had known he was there, and had been waiting for him. Every time there was that flicker of movement in the room, him, and no one else. And there, at last, just as I had expected, he was. I don't know that in reality I ever had expected him, or any one, but this was what I felt when, suddenly looking into that curious dim room, I saw him there. But this was what I felt when, suddenly looking into that curious dim room, I saw him there. He was sitting in the chair which he must have placed for himself, or which someone else in the dead of night, when nobody was looking, must have set for him, in front of the escritoire, with the back of his head towards me, writing. The light fell upon him from the left hand, and therefore upon his shoulders and the side of his head, which, however, was too much turned away to show anything of his face. Oh, how strange that there should be someone staring at him, as I was doing, and he never to turn his head, to make a movement. If anyone stood and looked at me, were I in the soundest sleep that ever was, I would wake, I would jump up, I would feel it through everything. But there he sat and never moved. You are not to suppose, though, I said the light fell upon him from the left hand, that there was very much light. There never is in a room you are looking into like that across the street, but there was enough to see him by. The outline of his figure, dark and solid, seated in the chair, and the fairness of his head visible faintly, a clear spot against the dimness. I saw this outline against the dim gilding of the frame of the large picture which hung on the farther wall. I sat all the time the visitors were there, in a sort of rapture, gazing at this figure. I knew no reason why I should be so much moved. In an ordinary way, to see a student at an opposite window quietly doing his work might have interested me a little, but certainly it would not have moved me in any such way. It is always interesting to have a glimpse like this of an unknown life, to see so much and yet know so little, and to wonder, perhaps, what the man is doing, and why he never turns his head. One would go to the window, but not too close, lest he should see you and think you were spying upon him, and one would ask, "Is he still there? Is he writing always? I wonder what he is writing." And it would be a great amusement, but no more. This was not my feeling at all in the present case. It was a sort of breathless watch, an absorption. I did not feel that I had eyes for anything else, or any room in my mind for another thought. I no longer heard, as I generally did, the stories and the wise remarks, or foolish, of Aunt Mary's old ladies or Mr. Pitt-Milley. I heard only a murmur behind me, the interchange of voices, one softer, one sharper, but it was not as in the time when I sat reading and heard every word, till the story in my book and the stories they were telling, what they said almost always shaped into stories, were all mingled into each other, and the hero in the novel became somehow the hero, or more likely heroine, of them all. But I took no notice of what they were saying now, and it was not that there was anything very interesting to look at, except the fact that he was there. He did nothing to keep up to the absorption of my thoughts. He moved just so much as a man will do when he is very busily writing, thinking of nothing else. There was a faint turn of his head as he went from one side to another of the page he was writing, but it appeared to be a long page which never wanted turning. Just a little inclination when he was at the end of the line outward, and then a little inclination inward when he began the next. That was little enough to keep one gazing. But I suppose it was the gradual course of events leading up to this, the finding out of one thing after another as the eyes got accustomed to the vague light. First the room itself, and then the writing table, and then the other furniture, and last of all the human inhabitant who gave it all meaning. This was all so interesting that it was like a country which one had discovered. And then the extraordinary blindness of the other people who disputed among themselves whether it was a window at all. I did not, I am sure, wish to be very disrespectful, and I was very fond of my Aunt Mary, and I liked Mr. Pitt-Milley well enough, and I was afraid of Lady Carnby. But yet to think of I know I ought not to say stupidity, the blindness of them, the foolishness, the insensibility, discussing it as if a thing that your eyes could see was a thing to discuss. It would have been unkind to think it was because they were old and their faculties dimmed. It is so sad to think that the faculties grow dim, that such a woman as my Aunt Mary should fail in seeing, or hearing, or feeling, that I would not have dwelt on it for a moment, it would have seemed so cruel. And then such a clever old lady as Lady Carnby, who could see through a millstone, people said, and Mr. Pitt-Milley such an old man of the world. It did indeed bring tears to my eyes to think that all those clever people, solely by reason of being no longer young as I was, should have the simplest things shut out from them, and for all their wisdom and their knowledge be unable to see what a girl like me could see so easily. I was too much grieved for them to dwell upon that thought, and half ashamed, though perhaps half proud too, to be so much better off than they. All those thoughts flitted through my mind as I sat and gazed across the street, and I felt there was so much going on in that room across the street. He was so absorbed in his writing, never looked up, never paused for a word, never turned round in his chair, or got up and walked about the room as my father did. Papa is a great writer, everybody says, but he would have come to the window and looked out. He would have drummed with his fingers on the pane. He would have watched a fly and helped it over a difficulty, and played with the fringe of the curtain, and done a dozen other nice, pleasant, foolish things, till the next sentence took shape. "My dear, I am waiting for a word." he would say to my mother when she looked at him, with a question why he was so idle in her eyes, and then he would laugh and go back again to his writing-table. But he, over there, never stopped at all. It was like a fascination. I could not take my eyes from him, and that little scarcely perceptible movement he made, turning his head. I trembled with impatience to see him turn the page, or perhaps throw down his finished sheet on the floor, as somebody looking into a window like me once saw Sir Walter do, sheet after sheet. I should have cried out if this unknown had done that. I should not have been able to help myself, whoever had been present. And gradually I got into such a state of suspense waiting for it to be done that my head grew hot and my hands cold, and then, just when there was a little movement of his elbow, as if he were about to do this, to be called away by Aunt Mary to see Lady Carnby to the door. I believe I did not hear her till she had called me 3 times, and then I stumbled up, all flushed and hot and nearly crying. When I came out from the recess to give the old lady my arm, Mr. Pitt-Milley had gone away some time before. She put up her hand and stroked my cheek. "What ails the bairn?" she said. "She's fevered. You must not let her sit laying in the window, Mary Balcarres. You and me know what comes of that." Her old fingers had a strange touch, cold like something not living, and I felt that dreadful diamond sting me on the cheek. I do not say that this was not just a part of my excitement and suspense, and I know it is enough to make anyone laugh when the excitement was all about an unknown man writing in a room on the other side of the way, and my impatience because he never came to an end of the page. If you think I was not quite as aware of this as anyone could be. But the worst was that this dreadful old lady felt my heart beating against her arm that was within mine. "You are just in a dream," she said to me with her old voice close at my ear as we went downstairs. "I don't know who it is about, but it's bound to be some man that is not worth it. If you were wise, you would think of him no more." "I am thinking of no man," I said, half crying. "It is very unkind and dreadful of you to say so, Lady Carnby. I never thought of any man in all my life," I cried in a passion of indignation. The old lady clung tighter to my arm and pressed it to her, not unkindly. "Poor little bird," she said. "How it's struggling and fluttering. I'm not saying but what it's more dangerous when it's all for a dream." She was not at all unkind, but I was very angry and excited, and would scarcely shake that old pale hand which she put out to me from her carriage window when I had helped her in. I was angry with her, and I was afraid of the diamond, which looked up from under her finger as if it saw through and through me, and whether you believe me or not, I am certain that it stung me again, a sharp, malignant prick, oh, full of meaning. She never wore gloves, but only black lace mittens through which that horrible diamond gleamed. I ran upstairs. She had been the last to go, and Aunt Mary too had gone to get ready for dinner, for it was late. I hurried to my place and looked across with my heart beating more than ever. I made sure I should see the finished sheet lying white upon the floor. But what I gazed at was only the dim blank of that window which they said was no window. The light had changed in some wonderful way during that 5 minutes I had been gone, and there was nothing, not a reflection nor a glimmer. It looked exactly as they all said, the blank form of a window painted on the wall. It was too much. I sat down in my excitement and cried as if my heart would break. I felt that they had done something to it, that it was not natural, that I could not bear their unkindness, even Aunt Mary. They thought it not good for me, and they had done something, even Aunt Mary herself, and that wicked diamond that hid itself in Lady Carnby's hand. Of course I knew all this was ridiculous as well as you could tell me, but I was exasperated by the disappointment and the sudden stop to all my excited feelings, and I could not bear it. It was more strong than I.